The library of the Moretti estate always smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive scotch after the lieutenants left. It was a heavy, masculine scent, one that clung to the velvet drapes and the dark mahogany bookshelves that lined the walls. Hannah Cole held her breath as she moved into the room, her grip tightening on the silver tray in her hands. She was 27 years old, but in this house, she felt like a ghost, a specter that drifted through the periphery of violence without ever making a sound. The meeting had ended 10 minutes ago. The heavy oak doors had swung open, and a stream of men in dark suits had filed out, their voices low and grim. Hannah had waited in the shadow of the hallway, her eyes fixed on the floor, making herself small. It was a survival instinct she had honed to perfection over the last 6 months. In the world of Luca Moretti, invisibility was not just a skill, it was a shield. She moved to the large conference table, her fingers working quickly to gather the crystal tumblers left behind. The amber liquid remaining in some of them caught the dim light of the chandelier. As she wiped a coaster, she replayed the fragments of conversation she had overheard while waiting outside. The walls of the mansion were thick, but the voices of angry men carried. They had spoken of debts that were unpaid. There was talk of a shipment lost near the docks and a territorial dispute that was bleeding into the northern districts, but it was the name of a rival crew that made her stomach turn. The tension in the house had been ratcheting up for weeks, twisting tighter like a violin string about to snap. Hannah stacked the glasses on her tray, the clinking sound dangerously loud in the silence. She paused, glancing toward the open door, fearing she had made too much noise. Just then, a shadow fell across the threshold. One of Luca's senior bodyguards, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, walked past. He did not look at her. He did not acknowledge her presence. To him, she was part of the furniture, less interesting than the lamp on the corner table. He brushed past the doorway, his shoulder clipping the frame, his eyes scanning the corridor for threats, completely blind to the woman standing 5 feet away. It happened constantly. Earlier that morning, the house manager, Mr. Henderson, had been taking inventory in the pantry when Luca Moretti himself had walked in. Hannah, of course, had been on her knees scrubbing a scuff mark from the marble floor, not 3 feet from Luca's polished dress shoes. "I need coffee," Luca had said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded attention without raising volume. "And tell the maid to press the gray suit. The black one has a tear in the lining." He had not looked down. He had not used her name. To Luca Moretti, the ruthless head of the most powerful crime family in Raventon, she was simply the maid, a function, a pair of hands that ensured his coffee was hot and his shirts were crisp. Hannah finished clearing the table, her chest aching with a hollow sort of loneliness. It was better this way, she told herself. Being seen meant being involved, and being involved meant danger. She had enough danger in her past to last a lifetime. She carried the heavy tray down the long, carpeted corridor toward the kitchen, navigating the labyrinthine mansion with practiced ease. The house was a fortress, guarded by high walls and men with guns. But for Hannah, it was a hiding place. By the time she finished her shift, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, plunging the coastal city of Raventon into a darkness that felt particularly heavy tonight. Hannah climbed the narrow servant stairs to the 3rd floor, where the attic rooms were located. Her living quarters were small, a single bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out over the sprawling back gardens. But they were hers, and more importantly, the door had a lock. She sat on the edge of the bed, her uniform stiff with the sweat of a 12-hour day. She pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen glowing bright in the dim room. There was a new message from her sister. "Please, Hannah, the landlord is threatening to evict us again. I need $300 by Friday. I am sorry." Hannah stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the screen. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She typed out a reply, her fingers trembling slightly. "I will send it tomorrow morning. Don't worry, stay inside." She set the phone down and rubbed her face with her hands. Every dollar she earned at the Moretti mansion went back home to the small town 2 hours inland where her younger sister lived. It was the only reason Hannah endured the long hours, the fear, and the crushing isolation. She needed the money to keep her sister safe, and she needed the mansion's walls to keep herself hidden. Her mind drifted, unwanted, to Eric Ward. The name alone made her skin crawl. Her ex-boyfriend was a man who confused possession with love and violence with discipline. He was the reason she had fled her hometown, the reason she flinched at loud noises, and the reason she had sought employment in a house guarded by the Mafia. Eric was dangerous, connected to low-level gangs, but even he would not dare cross the Moretti family, or so she hoped. She stood up, her muscles protesting, and moved to the small wardrobe. She needed to change. She needed to wash the smell of smoke and fear off her skin. Downstairs, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted violently. The heavy front doors burst open, slamming against the interior walls with a force that shook the crystal in the foyer chandelier. Luca Moretti stormed inside, the cool ocean air swirling around him. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and imposing, usually the picture of cold, calculated control. But tonight, he was a storm personified. Blood, dark and sticky, splattered the white cuff of his dress shirt. It was not his own, but the metallic scent of it clung to him, sharp and nauseating. "Secure the perimeter," Luca barked into the phone pressed to his ear. His other hand gripped a semi-automatic pistol, which he checked and then shoved into the holster beneath his jacket. "I want men on the gates and 2 rovers in the garden. Now." He strode across the marble foyer, ignoring the stunned looks of the night staff. His heart was still hammering against his ribs, a rhythmic reminder of how close the bullet had come. It had been an ambush, a sloppy, desperate attempt by a rival crew to take him out on 3rd Street. They had failed, but they had ruined his suit and his evening. "Move the funds from the offshore accounts," Luca commanded, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "If they are hitting us in the street, they are going to come for the assets next. Freezing them is not an option. Move them." He took the stairs 2 at a time, his mind racing through strategy, retribution, and logistics. He needed to get out of these clothes. He needed a shower. He needed 5 minutes of silence to think before he unleashed hell on the men who had tried to kill him. He reached the 2nd-floor landing and turned left, heading toward what he thought was his private guest wing, where he kept a spare change of clothes for emergencies. His mind was miles away, visualizing the map of the city, marking territories to burn. He was exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the shootout was fading, leaving behind a jagged weariness. He rubbed his temple with his free hand, listening to his second-in-command chatter on the other end of the line. "Do it," Luca snapped, "and tell Marco I want a name by morning." He stopped in front of a mahogany door. In his distracted state, he mistook the servant's auxiliary changing room for his guest suite. The layout of the mansion was vast, and he rarely ventured into this particular corridor. He pushed the door open, expecting an empty room and a closet full of suits. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him with his heel, still listening to the voice on the phone. "I do not care what it costs," Luca said, lowering the phone from his ear as he looked up. The words died in his throat. The room was not empty. Hannah stood in the center of the small, dimly lit space. She was facing away from him, unaware that the master of the house had just walked in. She was in the middle of changing out of her black and white uniform. Her blouse was unbuttoned and pulled down, hanging loosely around her elbows, leaving her back entirely bare to the cool air of the room. Time seemed to warp. The frantic energy of the ambush, the noise of the phone call, the rage pounding in Luca's veins, it all evaporated into a sudden, suffocating silence. He should have turned around immediately. He should have backed out and closed the door. But his feet felt leaden, rooted to the Persian rug, his eyes trained to spot weakness and danger, instantly locked onto the skin exposed by the fallen shirt. It was pale, creamy skin, the curve of her spine delicate and feminine, but that was not what stopped his breath. Marring the smooth skin of her left side, just along the ribcage, was a jagged, ugly scar, It looked old, a souvenir of a violence that had healed poorly. Surrounding it and scattered across her lower back were faint, yellowing shadows, bruises that were fading but still visible under the harsh overhead light. They were the marks of a hand, the marks of a boot, the map of someone's cruelty. Luca stared, his grip on his phone tightening until his knuckles turned white. He had seen violence in every form imaginable. He had inflicted it, he had survived it. But seeing it carved into the skin of the quiet woman who served his coffee struck him with a force he could not name. At the sound of his breathing, or perhaps the shift in air pressure, Hannah froze. She spun around, a gasp tearing from her throat. Her hands flew up, clutching the fabric of her blouse to her chest to cover herself, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Oh!" she cried out, stumbling back until her legs hit the edge of the small bed. Luca stood frozen in the doorway, his arm still half raised, the phone forgotten in his hand. For the first time in 6 months, he actually looked at her. He saw the way her dark hair fell in messy waves around her face, escaping the severe bun she wore during the day. He saw the high arch of her cheekbones and the terrified flutter of her pulse in the hollow of her throat. And he saw her eyes. They were a striking, deep hazel, and right now they were filled with a mixture of fear and fury that floored him. She was not just the maid, she was a woman. A terrified, scarred, beautiful woman standing half naked in a room he had invaded. The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Hannah's breathing was shallow and fast, her chest heaving against the bundle of clothes she held as a shield, her cheeks burned with a crimson flush that spread down her neck. Luca's throat felt tight. The image of that jagged scar on her ribs was burned into his retinas. He felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger, not at her, but at whoever had put it there. Luca started, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat, struggling to regain the composure that was his trademark. He took a step back, his hand finding the doorknob behind him. "I apologize," he muttered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He rarely apologized to anyone, let alone the staff. "I thought this was the guest suite." Hannah did not speak. She could not. She simply stared at him, her body trembling. She waited for him to yell, to fire her, to make a comment about her body. That was what men like Eric did. But Luca did not leer. His gaze dropped for a fleeting second to her bare shoulders, then snapped back to her eyes. There was hunger there. Yes, he was a man, and the intimacy of the moment was undeniable, but there was something else, too, something softer, a troubled confusion that furrowed his brow. "Excuse me," he said sharply, turning his back on her. He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut with a decisive click. Inside the room, Hannah collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her legs giving out. The blouse slipped from her fingers, but she barely noticed. She pressed her hands to her burning face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She replayed the moment over and over. The blood on his shirt, the intensity of his stare, the way his eyes had lingered on her side, where the scar from Eric's belt buckle still raised the skin. He had seen it. He had seen everything. Hannah hastily pulled her shirt back on, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She felt exposed, stripped of the anonymity that had been her safety. He had looked at her not as a servant, but as a person. And in his eyes, she had seen a flicker of something that terrified her more than his anger. He had looked concerned. "No," she whispered to the empty room, shaking her head. "No, I cannot let this happen." She stood up, smoothing her clothes with shaking hands. She would avoid him. She would take the cleaning shifts in the West Wing when he was in the East. She would keep her head down until she was invisible again. It had been an accident, just a stupid, humiliating accident. She would pretend it never happened. But down the hall, in the expansive, dimly lit office that served as the heart of the Moretti Empire, Luca was finding it impossible to pretend. He sat behind his massive ebony desk, a tumbler of amber whiskey untouched in front of him. The reports on the ambush lay spread out across the leather surface, maps, photos of the shooters, lists of potential informants. This was life and death, This was the war he had been born into. Usually, Luca could compartmentalize anything. He could shut off his emotions and focus entirely on the strategic move. But tonight, the text on the pages blurred. Every time he blinked, he saw the curve of her back. He saw the jagged white line of the scar. He saw the way she had clutched the shirt to her chest, her hazel eyes blazing with a defiance he had not expected from the mousy creature who dusted his bookshelves. He took a drink of the whiskey, the burn familiar and grounding. Hannah. He knew her name because he signed the payroll checks, but he had never spoken it. He had never thought it. Why did she have those bruises? They were old, fading yellow and green, but they told a story of sustained trauma. And the scar, that was not accidental. That was malicious. Luca leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking in the silent room. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the day. He was a man who dealt in violence, who commanded fear and respect. He protected his family, his business, his people. Hannah Cole lived under his roof. She slept in his house. She ate his food. Technically, she was one of his people, and someone had hurt her. The thought ignited a low, simmering heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the rival gang who had shot at him. It was a possessive, primal irritation. He realized, with a jolt of discomfort, that he had no idea who she was. She had been a shadow in his periphery for months, silent and dutiful, and he had looked right through her. He swirled the liquid in his glass, watching the vortex. How did I miss her? He wondered aloud, his voice low in the empty room. He remembered the tremble in her hands. She was terrified of him, or maybe she was terrified of men in general. Luca Moretti did not get distracted. It was the first rule of survival. But as the grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour, he found himself pushing the ambush reports aside. He sat in the dark, the whiskey warming his blood, unable to shake the image of the quiet maid and the secrets etched into her skin. For the first time in years, the great Luca Moretti was looking at something other than the prize, and he could not look away. The morning sun that filtered through the high windows of the Moretti mansion felt less like a new beginning and more like a spotlight. For Hannah, the vast, echoing corridors had transformed overnight, where she had once moved as a silent, invisible force. She now felt exposed, as if the very walls were whispering about what had happened in the guest wing. She flinched every time a floorboard creaked. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs whenever she heard heavy footsteps approaching, her mind instantly conjuring the image of Luca Moretti standing in that doorway. The memory of his gaze was a physical weight. It was not the leering look she had learned to fear from men like Eric, nor was it the dismissive glance of a busy employer. It had been piercing. It had been aware. Hannah kept her head down as she polished the mahogany banister on the second-floor landing, her movements mechanical. She was trying to scrub the memory from her mind, trying to retreat back into the safety of being the maid. But the air in the house had shifted. The equilibrium was broken. She made her way to the kitchen, the heart of the house's operations, hoping the clatter of pots and the shouting of the chefs would drown out her anxiety. She grabbed a cloth and a spray bottle, moving to the far counter to wipe down the marble prep surface. The kitchen doors swung open. Usually, the staff ignored the arrival of family members, continuing their work with respectful silence unless addressed. But the sudden drop in volume told Hannah exactly who had walked in before she even turned around. The air seemed to compress. Hannah froze, her hand stilling on the cold marble. She did not look up, fixing her eyes on a stubborn spot of grease, praying he would just grab an espresso and leave. "Good morning." Hannah, the sound of her name, spoken in that deep, gravelly baritone, caused her to jerk. Her hand slipped, knocking a crystal water glass near the edge of the counter. It wobbled dangerously, threatening to tip and shatter before she managed to steady it with trembling fingers. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Luca stood near the center island, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit his broad frame perfectly, looking as imposing and untouched as ever. But he was not looking at the head chef or the coffee machine. He was looking directly at her. Hannah stared at him. stunned. In 6 months, he had never greeted her. He had never even looked her in the eye for more than a second. "Good morning, sir," she managed to whisper, her voice tight. Luca did not move toward the coffee. He stayed where he was, his hands in his pockets, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her knees feel like water. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was lower now, pitched so that the other staff members, who were busying themselves at the stoves, could not hear. After last night. Heat flooded Hannah's face, rushing up from her neck to her hairline. She felt stripped bare all over again. She gripped the cleaning cloth like a lifeline, her knuckles turning white. "I am fine, sir," she said, her response stiff and automatic. It was the armor she wore. Deny, deflect, disappear. Luca took a step closer, invading her personal space just enough to make her heart race faster. His gaze dropped, tracing the line of her neck where the collar of her uniform buttoned high. He seemed to be looking for something, perhaps checking if the bruises he had seen on her back extended elsewhere. The scrutiny was not predatory, but it was heavy. "I did not mean to intrude," he said, the words awkward coming from a man used to giving orders. "It was an accident," Hannah interrupted, desperate to end the conversation before she suffocated. "Please, we can forget it happened." She looked up at him then, pleading with her eyes. She needed him to agree. She needed him to let her go back to being invisible, because being seen by a man like Luca Moretti was dangerous. It complicated things, and she could not afford complications. Luca held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the fear in her hazel eyes, the way she was poised to flee like a startled deer. "If that is what you want," he said slowly. "It is." She breathed. He nodded once, his expression unreadable, and finally turned away to pour himself a cup of black coffee. Hannah exhaled a breath she did not realize she had been holding and fled the kitchen as quickly as she could without running. Luca took his coffee to the terrace, but the bitter liquid did not settle the unease in his stomach. He had agreed to forget it, but his mind was not cooperating. He spent the morning in meetings, but during a break, he found himself walking toward the East Wing warehouse where some of the household supplies were kept. As he rounded the corner near the loading dock, a loud, braying laugh cut through the air. He stopped. It was Marco, one of the junior security staff, a man Luca had never particularly liked. He was loud, boastful, and sloppy with his patrols. Marco was leaning against a stack of crates, talking to another guard, a cigarette dangling from his lip. "I am telling you. I heard she was half naked," Marco was saying, leering. The boss walked right in on her. "Bet she has a nice setup under that baggy uniform. Maybe I should walk into the wrong room next time. Huh? See what all the fuss is about." The other guard laughed nervously, but Luca did not move. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, a cold, dark rage unfurling in his chest. It was a sensation he was familiar with when dealing with enemies who stole his shipments or threatened his territory. But this was different. This felt personal. Jealousy was a useless emotion. Luca knew this. It clouded judgment. Yet, hearing Marco speak about Hannah, about her body, about the private moment Luca had accidentally witnessed, made his hands curl into fists at his sides. The thought of Marco, or any other man, looking at Hannah, seeing her scars, seeing her vulnerability, made him want to break something. He stepped out of the shadows. Marco's laugh died instantly. The cigarette fell from his mouth as he scrambled to stand at attention. "Boss," Marco stammered, his face draining of color. "We were just—" "Pack your things," Luca said. His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. Marco blinked. "Boss, you are reassigned," Luca said, his eyes flat and cold. "The grim docks downtown need a night watchman. You start tonight." The downtown docks were a punishment post, cold, rat-infested, and miserable. It was a demotion so severe it was humiliating. "But why?" Marco asked, panic rising in his voice. "Because I do not like your voice," Luca said simply. "Get out of my sight." He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked away, straightening his cuffs. He told himself it was about discipline. Disrespect among the staff could not be tolerated. But as he walked back to the main house, he knew it was a lie. He had banished the man because he had dared to speak Hannah's name with a dirty mouth. 2 days later, the weather turned, the coastal skies of Raventon, usually a piercing blue, bruised into a heavy, dark purple. By nightfall, a massive storm battered the cliffs, rain lashing against the mansion windows like handfuls of gravel. Hannah hated storms. The noise reminded her of the nights Eric would come home drunk, slamming doors and throwing furniture. The thunder sounded too much like gunfire or heavy boots on floorboards. She was on the 3rd floor, carrying a stack of fresh towels to the linen closet, when the world went black. The power cut out instantly, plunging the windowless servants' staircase into absolute, suffocating darkness. Hannah gasped, dropping the towels. She froze, clutching the wooden railing with both hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to tell herself she was safe, that it was just a storm, but panic was rising in her throat, choking her. She could not move. Her feet felt nailed to the step. Suddenly, a beam of light sliced through the darkness above her. "Who is there?" A deep voice called out. Hannah let out a shaky breath. It was him. I am here," she stammered, her voice small in the dark stairwell. Heavy footsteps descended the stairs, steady and sure. The beam of the phone flashlight swung down, illuminating Hannah's pale face and her white-knuckled grip on the railing. Luca stopped 2 steps above her. The light cast sharp shadows across his face, emphasizing the hard angles of his jaw and the concern in his brow. "Hannah? Are you stuck?" he asked gently. I cannot see," she whispered, ashamed of her fear. "It is all right," he said. "The generator will kick in for the main floors in a moment, but these stairs are on a separate circuit. Here." He moved closer, the scent of expensive cologne and rain filling the small space. He reached out, not grabbing her, but hovering his hand near her arm. "Take my arm," he instructed softly. "I have the light." Hannah hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers brushed the sleeve of his shirt, feeling the hard muscle beneath the fine fabric. The contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. Luca shifted the light so it shone on the steps in front of them. Then, unexpectedly, he placed his free hand on the small of her back to guide her. The touch was electric, even through the fabric of her uniform. The heat of his palm branded her skin. It was a protective, firm touch, meant to steady her, but it made her breath hitch. "Careful," he murmured, his mouth close to her ear as they navigated the narrow turn of the stairs. They moved slowly, their bodies close in the shadowed intimacy of the stairwell. Every time he shifted, his chest brushed against her shoulder. Every time his fingers adjusted on her waist to guide her, she shivered. "You are trembling," Luca noted, his voice low. "I do not like storms," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the thunder rumbling outside. He did not laugh. He did not tell her to get over it. He simply tightened his grip on her back slightly, a silent reassurance. "I have got you," he said. "You are safe." The words were simple, but coming from him, the man who controlled the city's underworld, they felt like a vow. For a moment, Hannah let herself lean into his touch, drawing strength from his solid presence. He seemed reluctant to hurry, matching his pace to hers, guiding her down step by step as if she were precious cargo rather than a servant. They emerged into the kitchen just as the emergency lights flickered on in the hallway, bathing the room in a dim, ghostly glow. The kitchen was chaotic. Staff were running back and forth with flashlights, checking freezers and looking for candles. "Thank you," Hannah said, stepping away from him quickly, missing the warmth of his hand the moment it left her back. Luca opened his mouth to reply, but a chef hurried past with a tray of candles, forcing Luca to step back. In the confusion, Hannah turned to grab the counter for balance, but she misjudged the distance in the shadows. She bumped hard into a solid chest. "Oh," she stumbled back, losing her footing. Luca's hands shot out instinctively, catching her. His large hands gripped her hips, steadying her with ease. This time, there was no darkness to hide them. They stood in the dim, amber light of the emergency fixtures, bodies pressed close. Hannah looked up, breathless, her hands resting flat against his chest to brace herself. She could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heart beneath her palms. Luca looked down at her. His fingers lingered on the curve of her hips, his thumbs brushing the fabric of her apron. He did not let go. The chaos of the kitchen faded into the background, the shouting staff, the thunder outside, it all blurred. All Hannah could see were Luca's eyes. They were dark, dilated, and focused entirely on her mouth. The air between them crackled with a tension so thick it felt like a physical barrier had been shattered. They hovered there, inches apart, balancing on a knife's edge. Hannah saw his gaze flicker to her lips, saw his head lower just a fraction of an inch. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. "Sir, Mr.?" Henderson's voice boomed from the doorway. "The generator is failing in the west wing." The moment shattered like glass. Luca blinked, the spell breaking. He stepped back abruptly, his hands falling from her hips, his face masking over instantly with his usual cold authority. "Handle it!" Luca barked at Henderson, turning his back on Hannah. Hannah stood trembling by the counter, her skin still burning where he had touched her, watching him stride out of the room to command his soldiers. In the days that followed the storm, the dynamic shifted again. They did not speak of the moment on the stairs or the near miss in the kitchen. But Luca was watching her. He was subtle, but Hannah noticed. When he was in his office with the door open, she felt his eyes on her as she dusted the hallway. When she served dinner, he tracked her movements across the room. Luca began to collect details about her like intelligence reports. He noticed that she hummed quietly, an old lullaby when she thought she was alone in the library. He noticed the way her fingers flew nervously to braid her dark hair when the house was loud or chaotic. He noticed that she always volunteered for the late-night cleaning shifts, the ones that kept her away from the other staff and the bodyguards. One afternoon, Luca called Mr. Henderson into his study. "The maid, Hannah," Luca said, staring out the window at the rain-slicked driveway. "What is her schedule?" Henderson looked surprised. "She works 6 days a week." "Sir, mostly evenings and nights. She requested the extra hours. And her pay? Standard rate for live-in staff. Sir, double it," Luca said, turning to face him. "Sir?" Henderson blinked. "You heard me. And tell her the night shift is no longer required. She works days, when the security team is full, but she prefers the nights. I do not care what she prefers," Luca interrupted, his voice hardening. "It is not safe for a woman to be wandering this house at 3 in the morning alone. Change it." He could not explain that he hated the idea of her being awake and working while the rest of the world slept. He wanted her safe. He wanted her where people could see her, where he could see her. A week later, late in the evening, Luca was heading down to the wine cellar when he passed the laundry room. The door was ajar, and he heard a soft grunt of exertion. He paused, pushing the door open. Hannah was there, struggling with a massive canvas bag filled with wet linens. It was easily 50 pounds, awkward and heavy. She had it half lifted, her face flushed with effort, her teeth gritted as she tried to hoist it onto the sorting table. Without a word, Luca stepped into the room. Hannah let out a small yelp as the bag was suddenly lifted from her hands. Luca took the weight effortlessly, swinging the heavy sack onto the table as if it were filled with feathers. He turned to her, dusting his hands off on his trousers. "Why are you doing this alone?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "It is my job," Hannah said, breathless, wiping a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Your job is to maintain the house, not to break your back," Luca said sharply. He looked at her, really looked at her. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her frame looked too fragile for the heavy labor she was pushing herself to do. An unfamiliar ache settled in his chest, a sharp pang of protectiveness that frustrated him with its intensity. "You are not a machine." "Hannah," he said, his voice dropping to that softer register that he seemed to reserve only for her. "You deserve to rest." Hannah stared at him, stunned into silence. No one had ever told her she deserved rest. Eric had told her she was lazy. Her sister needed her to work. The world expected her to keep moving, to keep serving, to keep surviving. To hear this dangerous, powerful man tell her that she mattered enough to take a break, It cracked something inside her chest. "I have to work," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not like this," Luca said. He took a step closer, reducing the distance between them. The smell of detergent and clean linen surrounded them, but all Hannah could smell was him. "Leave it," he commanded gently. "The night staff can finish this. Go to bed." He stayed there until she nodded, until she untied her apron with shaking hands and placed it on the table. "Thank you," she murmured, avoiding his eyes because she knew if she looked at him, she might cry. Luca watched her leave the room, his jaw tight. He waited until her footsteps faded down the hall before he looked at the heavy bag of laundry. He felt a fierce desire to burn the whole world down if it meant she never had to struggle like that again. He was beginning to realize that the scar on her side was not the only wound she carried, and God help him, he wanted to heal them all. The city of Raventon was burning, though the flames were not yet visible to the naked eye. They flickered in the dark alleys near the shipyard and smoldered in the back rooms of gambling dens, where loyalty was bought and sold. Rumors of war drifted through the streets like fog, eventually curling under the heavy iron gates of the Moretti estate. Damian Cruz was making his move. Inside the mansion, the air was thick with tension. Luca Moretti had spent the last 3 nights in his study, the heavy oak desk littered with maps of the city and dossiers on Cruz's lieutenants. His eyes were gritty with exhaustion. His tie loosened, and a half-empty decanter of scotch sat near his elbow. The Cruz syndicate was aggressive, reckless, and hungry for territory that the Moretti family had held for decades. Luca stared at the map. Tracing the lines of the districts with a heavy pen, he needed to strike back. He needed to send a message that would shatter Cruz's confidence before the violence spilled into the civilian streets. But for the first time in his life, his legendary focus was fracturing. Every time he paused to think, his mind drifted from ballistics and supply lines to the quiet woman moving through the halls of his house, Hannah. He had tried to keep his distance after the incident in the laundry room, telling himself it was for her safety. But he found himself listening for her footsteps. He found himself checking the security feeds, not to look for intruders, but to catch a glimpse of her dark hair as she moved from room to room. The feelings were unwelcome, a dangerous distraction in the middle of a brewing war, but they were undeniably there. They were a soft ache in a chest that had been hardened by years of violence. While Luca plotted war in the West Wing, Hannah was fighting a battle of her own in the servants' quarters. It was late, past 11 at night. The house was quiet, settling into the groaning silence of a large estate sleeping. Hannah sat on the edge of her bed, her phone buzzing in her hand. She stared at the screen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The number was unknown, but she knew who it was. She could feel it in the cold dread that washed over her skin. She answered, her hand trembling so badly she nearly dropped the device. "Hello?" she whispered. "Hannah." The voice was like a physical blow. It was Eric. It was the sound of broken glass and shouting, the sound of pain. "How did you get this number?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I have my ways, babe," Eric said, his tone slurring slightly with alcohol and menace. "You think you can just run away? You think you can hide behind some gangster and I won't find you?" Hannah stood up, pacing the small length of her room, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Leave me alone. Eric, please, I know where you are," he hissed, the playfulness vanishing. "I know about the big house on the hill. I know who you work for." "You think he scares me? You belong to me. Hannah, not him. I do not belong to anyone," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "We will see about that." Eric laughed, a low, cruel sound that made her skin crawl. "I am coming for you, Hannah, and when I get you, you are going to wish you had never left." The line went dead. Hannah stared at the phone, the silence of the room suddenly deafening. He knew. He knew where she was. The sanctuary she had built, the walls she thought were impenetrable, suddenly felt like paper. She needed to move. She needed to do something to stop the shaking in her hands. She shoved the phone into her pocket and hurried out of her room, descending the back stairs toward the kitchen. She would make tea. She would clean something. She would find a task to occupy her hands until the panic subsided. Her mind was a whirlwind of terrified thoughts. If Eric came here, the guards would kill him, or worse, he would cause a scene, and Luca would fire her. If Luca knew she had brought this trouble to his doorstep, he would cast her out. She would be on the street, and Eric would be waiting. She grabbed a silver tray from the sideboard in the dining hall, intending to collect the coffee cups Luca had left in his study hours ago. It was an excuse to be busy, an excuse to be near the center of the house where the security was tightest. She walked down the long, carpeted hallway leading to the office. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, looking like grasping hands. Eric's voice echoed in her ears. "I know where you are." A floorboard creaked behind her. Hannah gasped, spinning around. No one was there, just the empty corridor and the eyes of the portraits on the wall. But the jolt of fear was too much. Her hands ravaged by tremors. She lost her grip on the heavy silver tray. It hit the hardwood floor with a crash that sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. The china cup shattered. The silver clattered and spun. Hannah dropped to her knees instantly, panic seizing her throat. "No, no, no," she whimpered, her hands hovering over the broken porcelain. She reached for a jagged shard, cutting her thumb, but she barely felt the sting. She had to clean it up. She had to hide the mess before anyone saw. The double doors at the end of the hall flew open. Luca Moretti surged into the hallway, his movement fluid and lethal. He had heard the crash and assumed the worst, an assassin, a breach. His hand was already reaching for the weapon holstered at the small of his back, his eyes scanning for threats. He stopped dead when he saw her. Hannah was on her knees in the middle of the wreckage, her shoulders shaking, her head bowed as she frantically gathered the broken pieces. She looked small, terrified, and utterly defeated. Luca's hand fell away from his weapon. The adrenaline of the soldier vanished, replaced instantly by a surge of concern that nearly knocked the wind out of him. "Hannah," he called out, his voice rough. She did not look up. She scrubbed at the floor, picking up invisible specks of dust. "I am sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. I slipped. I will pay for it. Please, I will clean it up." He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He crouched down beside her, ignoring the sharp porcelain shards that crunched under his shoes. "Stop," he said gently. "Hannah, stop. I can fix it," she babbled, her voice rising in hysteria. "Please do not be angry." She was not talking about the cups. Luca realized that with a chilling clarity. She was terrified, but not of him. This was a primal fear, a reaction to a ghost he could not see. He reached out, placing his large, warm hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Hannah, look at..." The moment his fingers brushed her skin, she flinched. It was a violent, full-body recoil, as if he had burned her. She jerked away, scrambling backward on her hands and knees, her eyes wide and wild, her breath coming in sobbing gasps. She threw her arms up instinctively to protect her face. Luca froze. His hand remained suspended in the air. The sight of her cowering before him, expecting a blow, tore something open inside him. It was a jagged, painful realization that made his blood run cold and then boil with a murderous heat. Slowly, deliberately, Luca lowered his hand. He stayed crouched, making himself smaller, less threatening. "Come with me," he said. His voice was low, devoid of command, filled only with a quiet, steely resolve. Hannah blinked, the reality of the room crashing back in. She looked at Luca, not Eric, but Luca, kneeling in the broken china, his expensive suit trousers ruined, his eyes dark with an emotion she could not name. "Sir, leave the mess," he said. "Stand up, Hannah. Come with me." He stood and offered her a hand. She hesitated, looking at his open palm, then at his face. He looked solid, safe, trembling. She placed her hand in his. He pulled her up gently, his grip firm but careful, as if she were made of the same fragile porcelain that littered the floor. He led her into his office and closed the heavy doors, shutting out the rest of the world. He guided her to the leather armchair in front of his desk and made her sit. Then he went to the decanter, poured a small amount of amber liquid into a glass and placed it in her hands. "Drink," he said. "It will help the shock." Hannah took a sip. the whiskey burning a path down her throat. Grounding her, she gripped the glass with both hands to stop them from shaking. Luca leaned against the front of his desk, crossing his arms. He did not sit behind the desk. He did not want any barriers between them. "Who scared you?" he asked. The question was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. Hannah looked down at the amber liquid. "Nothing, sir." "I was just clumsy. I am tired." "You did not flinch because you were clumsy," Luca said, his voice hard. "You flinched because you thought I was going to hit you." Hannah said nothing. A tear slipped from her lash and splashed onto her hand. Luca's voice dropped, becoming deadly soft. "Was it him? The one who gave you the scar?" Hannah's head snapped up, her eyes wide. He remembered. Of course he remembered. She took a shaky breath. "He called me tonight." Luca went very still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "He called you here?" He knows where I am," Hannah whispered, the dam finally breaking. "He said he is coming for me. He said I belong to him." She began to cry in earnest then, the tears flowing freely. She told him everything. She told him about Eric Ward. She told him about the drinking, the jealousy, the nights she spent locking herself in the bathroom. She told him about the night he had broken her ribs with his boot because she had smiled at a cashier in the grocery store. As she spoke, Luca's face transformed. The mask of the businessman fell away, revealing the predator beneath. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. His hands, gripping the edge of his mahogany desk, turned white at the knuckles. A darkness swirled in his eyes, a violent storm that should have terrified her, but strangely, it did not. Because the storm was not directed at her. It was standing between her and the world. When she finished, the room was silent save for her ragged breathing. Luca pushed off the desk. He moved toward her, and Hannah braced herself, unsure of what to expect. He knelt in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. He reached out, and this time, he moved slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, he reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His skin was rough, calloused from years of handling weapons and reins, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "He will never hurt you again," Luca said. It was not a promise. It was a fact. It was a decree issued by a king in his own kingdom. "He's dangerous," Hannah sniffled. "He has friends in gangs. I am the danger." "Hannah," Luca said softly, his eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity. "I am the thing that monsters are afraid of. Let him come. He'll not get within a mile of you." The conviction in his voice broke the last of her defenses. Hannah let out a sob and leaned forward. Luca met her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her wet cheekbones. "You are safe here," he murmured. "I swear it." The distance between them vanished. Their foreheads rested against each other, a bridge of intimacy in the quiet room. Hannah could feel the heat radiating from him, a solid wall of warmth that chased away the cold fear Eric had instilled in her. She breathed him in, sandalwood, whiskey, and the sharp metallic scent of the night air. Her hands moved of their own accord, finding purchase on his forearms, clutching the fabric of his shirt. For a long moment, they just breathed together, the tension shifting from fear to something else entirely, something heavier, something that made the air thick and hard to swallow. Luca pulled back just an inch, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, lingering on the pulse that fluttered wildly in her neck. His eyes dropped to her mouth. Hannah's heart skipped a beat. She saw the conflict in his gaze, the war between the man who wanted to protect her and the man who simply wanted. She saw him hesitate, fighting a battle with his own restraint. She did not want him to win that battle. Her gaze fell to his lips. Luca made a low sound in his throat, a sound of surrender. He closed the distance. The kiss was slow at first, cautious, a question asked in the silence. His lips were warm and firm against hers. He was giving her a choice, a chance to push him away. But Hannah did not push. She melted. The relief of being held, of being protected, crashed into the sudden, overwhelming realization of how much she wanted him. She opened to him, a soft sigh escaping her throat, That small sound shattered Luca's restraint. The kiss deepened instantly, turning hungry and urgent. He stood up, pulling her with him, his arms wrapping around her waist to crush her against his chest. Hannah gasped, her hands sliding up his chest to clutch his shirt, pulling him closer, needing to be as close as physically possible. He walked her backward until her lower back hit the edge of the heavy desk. He pressed into her, his body hard and demanding, surrounding her. His hands were everywhere, sliding up her spine, tangling in her hair, gripping her waist as if to anchor her to the earth. It was a kiss of desperation. It tasted of fear and salvation. It was the unleashing of weeks of stolen glances and suppressed desire. Hannah felt a fire ignite in her stomach, burning away the cold dread of Eric's call, in Luca's arms. She was not a victim. She was alive. She was wanted. Luca groaned against her mouth, the sound vibrating through her chest. He tilted her head back, deepening the angle, devouring her with a passion that left her dizzy. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful. She felt cherished. Bzzzt, bzzzt. The sharp, jarring vibration of a phone on the wooden desk cut through the haze like a knife. They broke apart as if physically struck. Hannah stumbled back slightly, her chest heaving, her lips swollen and red. Her hair was a mess, her eyes wide and dazed. Luca stood frozen, his hands still hovering near her waist, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the dark iris. The phone buzzed again. Reality rushed back into the room. The maps on the desk, the broken china in the hallway, the fact that he was the Don of the Moretti family and she was his maid. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. Shame, hot and scorching, washed over her. What had she done? She had just kissed her employer. She had just sought comfort in the arms of a man who killed people for a living. I am sorry, she stammered, backing away toward the door. I should not have. I'm so sorry. Hannah, wait, Luca said, his voice rough. He reached for her, but she stepped out of his range. Please, she begged, tears welling in her eyes again, but this time from confusion and guilt. Please, sir. Pretend this never happened. I was upset. I was not thinking. She turned to the door, her hand gripping the brass handle. I cannot do that, Luca said. She froze. She looked back at him. He had not moved to answer the phone. He was staring at her with a look of absolute clarity. I do not regret it, he said quietly. Hannah's breath hitched. I know you are scared, Hannah. I know my world is complicated, but I do not regret kissing you, and I will not pretend I do not want to do it again. Luca, I want to know you, he interrupted, his voice steady, not as the maid, not as a victim. I want to know the woman who hums in my library and puts up with my temper. Hannah stared at him, her heart aching. It was a beautiful thing to hear. It was a fairy tale. But she knew how fairy tales ended for girls like her. You can't, she whispered. It is too dangerous. She opened the door and fled into the hallway, leaving Luca alone in the office with the buzzing phone and the lingering scent of her fear and desire. Across the city, in a warehouse that smelled of diesel and rotting fish, the atmosphere was far less romantic. Damian Cruz sat on a crate, smoking a thin cigar, watching the man pacing in front of him. Eric Ward was a mess of nervous energy and cheap bravado. He was pacing back and forth, kicking at invisible dirt on the concrete floor. She hung up on me, Eric spat, running a hand through his greasy hair. She is scared, Damian said smoothly, his voice like oil. That is good. Fear makes people make mistakes. I want her back, Eric said, turning to look at the crime lord. You said you could help me get her back, and I will, Damian promised, a shark-like smile spreading across his face. But you have to be patient. Eric, Hannah is not just your girlfriend anymore. She's inside the fortress. She is our key. Damian stood up and walked over to Eric, placing a hand on the smaller man's shoulder. My sources tell me Luca Moretti has been distracted lately. He's making changes to his household. He is softening, and it is all because of her. Eric scowled. She's nothing special, just a cleaner. To you, perhaps, Damian mused, but to Moretti? I think she is becoming a weakness, and in my line of work, a weakness is a weapon. Damian took a drag of his cigar, the tip glowing bright orange in the gloom. "We are going to use your anger, Eric. We are going to use your history. We are going to snatch her right out from under his nose, and when Luca Moretti comes to save his little pet, we will be waiting." Eric grinned, a nasty, jagged expression. "I just want to teach her a lesson." "Oh, you will," Damien said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "We are going to teach everyone a lesson." The storm outside the warehouse raged on, but the real storm was just beginning, and Hannah Cole was standing directly in its path. The atmosphere within the Moretti mansion had shifted from a tense silence to a low, buzzing hum of speculation. In a household run by silence and rigid hierarchy, nothing was louder than a change in the Don's routine, and Luca Moretti had changed everything. It started with the subtle commands. A gardener who had whistled as Hannah walked past was fired within the hour. The head of security was given strict instructions that no one, absolutely no one, was to speak to Hannah with anything less than the respect they would accord a guest of the family. Then came the doctor's appointment. Hannah had mentioned a persistent cough, a lingering effect of the damp attic air, to the house manager. An hour later, she found Luca standing in the driveway next to a sleek, black sedan, the driver's door open. He was not waiting for a chauffeur. He held the keys himself. "Get in," Luca had said, holding the passenger door open for her. The drive to the clinic in downtown Raventon was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Hannah sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching Luca's profile as he navigated the city streets. He drove with the same effortless control he applied to his empire. His large hands relaxed on the leather steering wheel. "You did not have to do this," Hannah said softly, looking out at the passing storefronts. "You have a meeting at 2. "The meeting can wait," Luca replied, his eyes checking the rearview mirror from habit. "I do not trust the junior drivers. They drive like they have something to prove." He glanced over at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Besides, I wanted to make sure you are taken care of." The gossip in the kitchen was relentless after that. The cook whispered to the scullery maid, and the guards exchanged knowing looks near the gate. Hannah Cole, the invisible maid, was suddenly the center of gravity in the Moretti household. She felt the eyes on her constantly, curious, envious, and confused. But whenever she felt overwhelmed, she remembered the way Luca had adjusted the climate control in the car without her asking, simply because he noticed she had shivered. Their relationship existed in the stolen moments between the chaos of his life and the routine of hers. Early one Tuesday morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon, Hannah was in the kitchen preparing the first pot of espresso. The house was still sleeping, the marble countertops cool under her palms. She wore a simple, oversized sweater and leggings, having not yet changed into her uniform, a uniform she wore less and less these days at Luca's insistence. She was reaching for the sugar canister on the high shelf, standing on her tiptoes, when she felt a warm presence behind her. "Allow me," a deep voice murmured. Hannah didn't jump. Her body had attuned itself to his frequency. She felt the heat radiating from his chest as he stepped in close behind her, effectively trapping her against the counter. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the air between them crackled. Luca reached up, his arm brushing against hers, and easily retrieved the canister. He set it down on the counter but didn't step back. "Good morning, Hannah," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," she breathed. Turning around, she found herself caged between the marble edge and his body. He was dressed in casual clothes, a dark t-shirt and loose trousers, which made him look younger, less like a mafia boss and more like a man. He leaned down, his face inches from her ear. "You put too much sugar in my coffee yesterday," he teased, the vibration of his voice humming against her skin. "I think you were trying to sweeten me up." Hannah flushed, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She felt bold in the quiet safety of the morning. "Maybe you need sweetening," she countered, glancing up at him through her lashes. "You growl at everyone else." Luca chuckled, a low, resonant sound that made her knees weak. He leaned back slightly, looking down at her with an affection that made her chest ache. "Only at everyone else," he promised. "Never at you." He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her jawline for a heartbeat longer than necessary before stepping away to let her pour the coffee. The sweetness of the mornings, however, was often balanced by the darkness of the nights. 3 days later, Raventon was on edge. The feud with the cruise syndicate was escalating. A warehouse had been torched near the docks, and Luca had spent 12 hours in a war room meeting, his mood foul and his patience thin. Hannah found him late that night on the balcony outside the staff quarters. It was a secluded spot that overlooked the city, far away from the main entertaining areas. She was sitting on a bench, hugging her knees to her chest, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. She heard the heavy tread of his boots and knew it was him. He stepped out into the cool night air, smelling of cigar smoke and tension. He didn't say a word. He simply sat down beside her on the small bench, his thigh pressing against hers. "It is cold," he noted. He shrugged off his heavy suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The silk lining was still warm from his body, and the weight of it felt like a shield. "You should be resting," Hannah said, pulling the lapels of the jacket closer. "You look exhausted." "I cannot sleep," Luca admitted. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring out at the skyline he controlled. "Too much noise in my head." He turned his head to look at her. The moonlight washed out the color of his eyes, turning them into pools of shadow. "What were you thinking about?" he asked. "Before I came out," Hannah hesitated. "About my sister," she said quietly. "About how different her life is from this. She worries about math tests and rent. You worry about everything." Luca let out a short, dry laugh. "I worry about survival. That is all this is." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His thumb rubbed the back of her knuckles. A rhythmic, soothing motion. "I never noticed people like you before." "Hannah," he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I walked through this house for years. Blind. I was too busy fighting, too busy controlling every outcome, too busy making sure no one could touch me." He squeezed her hand, "And then I walked into the wrong room," he said, his gaze intensifying. "And suddenly, you were the only clear thing in my life, the only thing that made sense." Hannah's heart pounded against her ribs. "Luca." He leaned in. This was not like the kiss in the office, fueled by adrenaline and fear. This was deliberate. He tilted his head, giving her every chance to turn away. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers. It was slow, tender, and devastatingly gentle. It was a kiss that tasted of longing and a deep, unspoken weariness. He kissed her as if she were made of glass, as if he were afraid his own darkness would shatter her. Hannah melted into him. The jacket slipped from her shoulders as she reached for him, her hands tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened, shifting from tender to urgent in a heartbeat. The friction of the day, the fear of the war, the impossibility of their connection, it all poured into the contact. Luca groaned low in his throat. He pulled her closer, and Hannah, emboldened by the dark and his obvious need, climbed into his lap. He caught her easily, his hands sliding around her waist, his thumbs stroking the sensitive curve of her hips through her thin sweater. They clung to each other, breathing rough air, seeking an anchor in the storm. Hannah pressed herself against him, feeling the hard lines of his body, the power he held in check. A sharp clatter from the garden below, a guard dropping a flashlight, shattered the moment. Luca froze instantly, his head snapping toward the sound, his body turning rigid as iron. The soldier was back. He relaxed only slightly when he realized it was just a patrol. He looked back at Hannah, who was flushed and breathless in his lap. He gently smoothed her hair, his eyes filled with a regretful heat. "We are exposed here," he whispered, his voice rough. "Come inside." The inevitable conclusion to their building tension came 2 nights later. It had been another long day. Luca had intercepted a shipment meant for Cruz, a dangerous maneuver that had required his personal oversight. He came back to the mansion buzzing with adrenaline, his blood singing with the thrill of the victory and the stress of the risk. He found Hannah in the library, shelving books. He didn't say a word. He simply took her hand and led her up the grand staircase to the east wing, to his bedroom. The room was vast, dominated by a massive bed and decorated in dark woods and heavy fabrics. It was a masculine space, a sanctuary where few were allowed. Luca closed the door and locked it. The sound of the tumblers clicking into place echoed in the silence. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes made Hannah's breath catch. There was no hesitation now. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice steady but his hands betraying him. Hannah nodded. She was terrified. Yes, he was a powerful man, and she was carrying scars from a man who had abused his power. But Luca was not Eric. She knew that in her bones. "Yes," she whispered. He stepped closer. He reached out and began to undo the buttons of her blouse. His hands, usually so steady with a gun or a steering wheel, were trembling. He undid the first button. His eyes locked on hers. He undid the second. His knuckles grazed the skin of her collarbone, and he paused, watching her face for any sign of fear. "Is this okay?" he asked softly. "Yes," Hannah breathed, her heart hammering. He continued, peeling the fabric away with a reverence that made her want to weep. When the shirt fell open, revealing the camisole beneath and the jagged scar on her side, Luca didn't look away. He dropped to his knees. Hannah gasped, looking down at the most feared man in Raventon kneeling before her. Luca pressed a kiss to her stomach, right over the scar. It was a gesture of worship, of apology for the world that had hurt her. He stood up then, pulling her into his arms. The kiss they shared was raw and consuming. Hannah pulled him closer, her hands exploring the muscles of his back, feeling the tension uncoil. They moved toward the bed, a tangle of limbs and whispered names. As they fell onto the mattress, the world outside the heavy velvet curtains ceased to exist. There were no gang wars, no debts, no social hierarchies. There was only the heat of his skin, the desperate slide of his hands on her waist, and the way he whispered her name like a prayer against her neck. The scene faded into the shadows of the room, leaving only the soft sounds of intimacy and the feeling of two broken people finally fitting together. The morning after brought a harsh light to Hannah's new reality. She woke up alone in Luca's massive bed, the sheets smelling of sandalwood and him. He had left a note on the pillow saying he had early business but would be back for dinner. As Hannah dressed and walked back to her own room to change, the euphoria of the night began to curdle into anxiety. She was the maid. He was the Don. She saw the way the senior lieutenants looked at her when she passed them in the hall now, calculating, assessing. Was she a weakness? Was she a fling? She felt cherished. Yes. Luca made her feel like a queen when they were alone, but she was terrified. She worried she was just a conquest, a novelty that would wear off once the war with Cruz was won. And worse, she worried about what would happen if his enemies found out. She was walking through the main foyer when she caught her reflection in a large gilt mirror. She looked different. Her hair was looser, her cheeks flushed. She looked like a woman in love, and that made her a target. Miles away, in a nondescript sedan parked on a hill overlooking the Moretti estate. Damien Cruz lowered his binoculars. "He always leaves at 7 in the morning, Damien said, his voice calm. "The shift change at the gate happens at 7:15. There is a 15-minute window where the perimeter is monitored by the B team in the driver's seat." Eric Ward gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I saw her," Eric spat. "Walking across the courtyard yesterday. She looks happy." Damien smiled. A cold, shark-like expression. Happiness makes people careless. "Eric." Damien opened a notebook on his lap. He had been tracking the movements of the household for weeks. He knew the grocery delivery schedule. He knew when the trash was collected. And he knew that on Thursdays, Hannah Cole left the mansion at 2 in the afternoon to pick up specialty herbs from a market in Little Italy for the cook. "She goes to the market today," Damien said, checking his watch. "Luca sends a junior guard with her." "Just one." "He's arrogant," Eric sneered. "He's comfortable," Damien corrected, "and that will be his downfall. We take her at the market, Quick, clean. We put her in the van, and by the time Moretti realizes she is gone, we will have the leverage to force him into the warehouse. Eric looked at the mansion, his eyes burning with a toxic mix of jealousy and anticipation. I cannot wait to see the look on his face when he realizes I have her, Eric muttered. Back at the mansion. The fragile bubble of happiness Hannah was floating in was about to be popped. She was carrying a stack of fresh towels toward the master suite, her mind replaying the way Luca had kissed her scar, when she heard voices coming from the study. The door was slightly ajar. She slowed down, intending to announce herself, but Luca's voice froze her in place. It was cold, detached. The voice of the dawn, not the man who had held her last night. "We cannot keep carrying dead weight," Luca was saying. "It is a liability. I need to cut it loose before the meeting with Cruz." Hannah inhaled sharply. A lieutenant responded. "Something about loyalty and time served." "I do not care about time served," Luca snapped. "If it makes me vulnerable, it goes. I cannot afford distractions right now. This needs to be done cleanly." Hannah backed away, her heart shattering in her chest. Liability, distraction, cut it loose. She turned and fled down the hall, her vision blurring with tears. She didn't hear the rest of the conversation. She didn't hear Luca explain that he was talking about a corrupt capo who had been skimming profits and leaking info to Cruz. All she heard was the confirmation of her deepest fear. She was a distraction. She was a liability. The night before had been a goodbye, or perhaps just a moment of weakness he now regretted. She reached her room and collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow to stifle her sobs. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, hoping against hope it was Luca explaining, apologizing. It was a text from an unknown number. Tick-tock. "Hannah, I'm coming to pick you up. Be ready." Hannah stared at the screen, the blood draining from her face. Eric. She felt the walls closing in. On one side, the man she loved who viewed her as a liability to be cut loose. On the other, a monster who wanted to possess her. She stood up, wiping her eyes with a fierce determination born of desperation. If Luca was going to cut her loose, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. And if Eric was coming, she wouldn't be a sitting duck. She had to survive. She had to be strong. But as she prepared for her afternoon errand to the market, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into a trap, and this time, there would be no one to catch her. The afternoon sun glared off the asphalt of the grocery store parking lot, baking the air with the smell of exhaust and hot tar. It was a mundane Tuesday in Raventon, the kind of day that felt deceptively safe. Hannah Cole pushed a shopping cart containing a few bags of specialty herbs and fresh produce, the metal wheels rattling over the uneven ground. She was not alone. 5 paces behind her walked Leo, a junior bodyguard Luca had assigned to her. He was young, barely 22, and looked bored behind his dark sunglasses. He checked his phone every few seconds, clearly thinking that guarding the maid on a grocery run was a waste of his time. Hannah's mind was miles away from the grocery list. The conversation she had overheard earlier that morning played on a loop in her head, each word a fresh cut. Liability, distraction, cut it loose. The words felt like a physical weight in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had allowed herself to believe in a fairy tale, to believe that a man like Luca Moretti could look at a woman like her and see a future. But she had been wrong. She was just a weakness to be excised before a war. She reached her car, a modest sedan that belonged to the household fleet. She popped the trunk and began loading the bags. "Leo," she called out softly, not wanting to startle him but needing the keys. "Can you unlock the doors?" Leo looked up, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Yeah, sure thing. Hannah, just let me—" The sentence ended in a sickening thud. Hannah spun around just in time to see Leo crumble to the pavement, a dark figure standing over him with a collapsible baton. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth, smelling of stale tobacco and sweat, an arm banded around her waist, dragging her backward with terrifying force. She kicked out, dropping a bag of oranges that rolled across the blacktop like bright, mocking marbles. She clawed at the arm holding her, her fingernails digging into a leather jacket. Got you!" A voice hissed in her ear. The voice turned her blood to ice. It was Eric. Panic, sharp and blinding, exploded in her brain. She tried to bite his hand, tried to throw her weight back, but another man appeared from the side, one of Damian Cruz's soldiers. He grabbed her legs, lifting her off the ground as they rushed her toward a black SUV idling in the fire lane with its sliding door open. "No!" Hannah screamed into the hand, the sound muffled and useless. They threw her into the back seat. She scrambled to the other side, reaching for the handle, but Eric was on top of her instantly, pinning her down. She saw her phone slip from her pocket and fall onto the asphalt outside, just as the heavy door slammed shut. Through the tinted glass, she watched the grocery store drift away as the SUV peeled out of the lot. Her phone lay shattered on the ground, the screen spiderwebbed, vibrating with an incoming call she would never answer. In the cool, climate-controlled office of the Moretti mansion. Luca Moretti was reviewing the final logistics for the strike against the Cruz syndicate. He felt a strange unease, a prickling at the base of his neck that he usually associated with an ambush. He checked his watch. Hannah should have been back 10 minutes ago. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. It rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. He frowned, tapping the desk. He called Leo next. No answer. The unease bloomed into full-blown dread. Luca stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He walked to the window, staring down at the driveway, willing her car to appear. His phone rang. It was the head of his security detail. Boss. The voice on the line was tight, breathless. "We just got a call from a bystander at the Market Street grocery. There was an altercation. We have a man down." "Who?" Luca demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying register. "It is Leo. Sir, he's unconscious, and Hannah, the witness, says a woman was dragged into a black vehicle." The phone in Luca's hand cracked under the pressure of his grip. The plastic casing splintered, biting into his palm, but he did not feel the pain. The world stopped. The maps on his desk, the millions of dollars in assets, the territorial war, it all evaporated. The only thing that existed was the sudden, suffocating void where Hannah should have been. "Find them!" Luca roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a wounded animal. He stormed out of the office, throwing the door open so hard it rebounded off the wall. His lieutenants, who were waiting in the hall, jumped to their feet, startled by the sheer violence radiating from their leader. "Get me every camera feed in the city," Luca shouted, marching toward the operations room. "I want eyes on every street, every alley, every highway exit. If a black SUV moves in Raventon, I want to know about it." "Sir," one of the capos stepped forward, his face pale. "We are in lockdown mode. Moving that many men will expose our—" "I do not care about the exposure." Luca grabbed the man by the lapels of his jacket, shoving him against the wall. "They have her. Do you understand? They have Hannah." He released the man and turned to the room, his eyes wild and burning with a panic he had never allowed anyone to see. "Find her, or I will burn this entire city to the ground myself." Hannah woke up to the smell of dust and old iron. Her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and her mouth tasted of copper. She tried to move her hands and found them bound tightly behind her back, the rough rope digging into her wrists. She blinked her eyes open, struggling to focus in the dim light. She was in a small, glass-walled office overlooking a vast, empty warehouse floor. The windows were grimy, filtering the afternoon light into a sickly yellow haze. "Well, look who is finally awake!" Hannah flinched, turning her head. Damian Cruz was sitting on the edge of a metal desk, his legs crossed at the ankles, watching her with a detached curiosity. He wore a pristine white suit that looked out of place in the filth of the warehouse. "Where is Eric?" Hannah rasped, her throat dry. "Right here, babe." Eric stepped out of the shadows behind her chair. He looked manic, his eyes bloodshot, his movements twitchy. He walked around to face her, a sneer twisting his lips. "You look good." "Hannah," Eric said, reaching out to touch a lock of her hair, a little beat up, "but you always cleaned up nice." "Don't touch me," Hannah spat, jerking her head away. Eric's face darkened instantly. He drew his hand back and slapped her hard across the cheek. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side. Pain exploded in her jaw, radiating up to her temple. She tasted fresh blood in her mouth. "You don't get to talk to me like that anymore," Eric shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. "You think you are better than me because you are sleeping with him? You are nothing. You are just a maid I threw away." Hannah slowly turned her head back to face him. Her cheek was throbbing, already beginning to swell, but her eyes were dry. The fear that had paralyzed her in the car was gone, replaced by a cold, hard ember of anger. "He treats me better than you ever did," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Eric froze. "What did you say?" "He respects me," Hannah said, locking eyes with her abuser. "He listens to me. He does not need to hit a woman to feel like a man." Eric let out a howl of rage. He raised his fist, stepping forward to deliver a blow that would likely break her nose. "Enough," Damien said. The command was spoken softly, but it stopped Eric in his tracks. Damien slid off the desk and walked over, placing a hand on Eric's chest to push him back. "She's not a punching bag. Eric, she is currency. You break her, and she loses her value." Damien turned his gaze to Hannah. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You have spirit. I like that. It will make breaking Luca that much sweeter." He pulled a smartphone from his pocket and tapped the screen. "Let us see how much he really respects you," Damien said. In the operations room at the Moretti mansion, the large main screen flickered to life, an incoming video call request from an encrypted number. "Accept it," Luca ordered, his voice like gravel. The screen illuminated. The room went deadly silent. The image was grainy, but the subject was unmistakable. Hannah was tied to a chair, her head slumped slightly forward. There was a dark, blossoming bruise on her left cheek, and her lip was split. Eric stood behind her, one hand gripping her hair to pull her head up, a pistol pressed against her temple. Damien stood in the foreground, smiling pleasantly. Luca felt his heart stop. A physical pain tore through his chest, sharp enough to bring him to his knees, but he forced himself to stand rigid. His hands gripped the back of a leather chair so hard the leather tore under his fingernails. "Hello." "Luca," Damien said, his voice tinny through the speakers. "I believe I have something of yours." "Let her go," Luca said. The words were low, a vibration of pure, concentrated murder. "If you touch her again, Damien, there will be no hole deep enough for you to hide in." Damien chuckled. "Touchy, touchy. I am not the one you should be worried about. Eric here. He has some unresolved issues with the girl." On the screen, Eric yanked Hannah's hair harder. She winced, a small sound of pain escaping her throat. That sound shattered Luca's composure. He lunged toward the screen, only to be held back by his own instincts. "What do you want?" Luca roared. "Midnight," Damien said, checking his gold watch. "The old shipping docks at Pier 9. You know the place." "I know it," Luca said. "Come alone," Damien commanded. "No weapons, no soldiers, just you. You walk through the main gates with your hands up. If I see a single shadow, if I smell a trap..." Damien continued, his voice hardening. "She disappears into the river, and I will make sure she is awake when she hits the water." The screen went black. The silence in the operations room was deafening. "It is a trap, boss," the head of security said immediately. "You cannot go alone. They will execute you the moment you step onto the pier." "I know," Luca said, turning away from the black screen. He was already moving toward the weapons cache on the wall. "Sir, we can formulate a breach plan," another lieutenant argued. "We can hit the warehouse now that we know—" "We do not have time," Luca shouted, grabbing a tactical vest and strapping it over his dress shirt. "They are moving her to the pier. If we attack the warehouse, they kill her. If I do not show up at midnight, they kill her." He checked the magazine of a handgun and shoved it into his waistband, then grabbed a second one for an ankle holster. "I am going to the pier," Luca said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "And I am going to walk through those gates just like he asked. But sir, but you," Luca interrupted, looking at his men with eyes that burned with cold fire, "are going to be already there." He pointed to the map of the dockyards on the table. "I want snipers on the cranes. I want a dive team in the water under the pier. I want a strike team in the shipping containers 300 yards out. You move in silence. You do not engage until I give the signal." "What is the signal?" the security chief asked. Luca looked at the blank screen where Hannah's bruised face had been. "When I kill Damian Cruz," Luca said, "that is the signal." The night air at the docks was thick with fog and the smell of salt water. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant clang of a buoy bell and the lapping of dark water against the rotting pilings. Inside the main warehouse at the end of the pier, Hannah sat tied to the chair. They had moved her an hour ago, throwing a hood over her head and driving in silence. Now, the hood was off. She was exhausted. Her body ached from the tension and the blows she had taken, but her mind was racing. She watched Damian checking his weapon near the door. Eric was pacing nervously behind her. She tested the ropes at her wrists again. They were hemp, rough and scratchy. For the last hour, she had been slowly, painfully twisting her wrists back and forth. The skin was raw and bleeding, but the moisture from the blood had made the fibers slightly slippery. She remembered the way Luca's men tied knots. She had seen them securing crates in the mansion's garage. Simple, efficient knots meant to hold tight under tension. But if she could create slack... She slumped forward, feigning unconsciousness. "Hey," Eric kicked the leg of her chair. "Wake up, your boyfriend is almost here." Hannah groaned, letting her head loll to the side, under the cover of her body's position. She twisted her wrists violently, ignoring the searing pain as the rope burned her skin. She felt a strand give way. She took a deep breath. She was not a liability. She was not a distraction. She was Hannah Cole, and she was going to survive. "He is here," Damian announced, peering through a crack in the metal doors. The heavy doors groaned open. Luca Moretti walked into the vast open space of the pier warehouse. The moonlight spilled in behind him, outlining his silhouette. He wore a simple black shirt and trousers. His hands were raised above his head, palms open. He looked unarmed. He looked alone. But Hannah saw his eyes. They were scanning the room, analyzing angles, counting shadows. And when his gaze landed on her, the mask of the stoic Mafia Don cracked. She saw the torture in his expression, the raw, agonizing fear for her safety. "Luca," she whispered. Damian stepped into the light, his gun raised. "Right on time." Damian smiled. "I am impressed. I did not think the great Luca Moretti had a heart to break. Let her go." "Damian," Luca said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I am here. You have me. Let her walk away." Damian laughed. "I don't think so. I think I will keep her. Maybe I will give her back to Eric when I am done with you." Luca's jaw tightened. He took a step forward. Damian tutted, aiming the gun at Hannah's head. "Kneel." Luca froze. He looked at Hannah, his eyes communicating a silent message she couldn't quite decipher. "Trust me." Slowly, agonizingly, Luca sank to his knees on the concrete floor. Eric let out a whoop of triumph. "Look at him! Look at him on his knees!" Damian walked closer to Luca, the gun never wavering from Hannah. "This is the end of the Moretti Empire," Damian declared, savoring the moment. Not with a bang, but with a beg. Damian raised his gun, shifting his aim from Hannah to the center of Luca's forehead. Eric, meanwhile, had moved to stand right next to Hannah, his own gun pointed loosely at Luca, distracted by his own glee. Hannah saw Luca's muscles tense. He was waiting to die. No. The words screamed in Hannah's mind. She would not watch him die. She would not be the weakness that killed him. She wrenched her wrists with every ounce of hysterical strength she possessed. The frayed rope snapped. In one fluid, desperate motion, Hannah lunged. She didn't go for the door. She went for Eric. She grabbed Eric's gun arm with both hands and jerked it upward just as his finger tightened on the trigger in surprise. Bang! The gunshot went wild, tearing into the metal roof. The deafening sound shattered the standoff. Damian flinched, turning his head toward the noise for a fraction of a second. Hannah didn't stop. She threw her weight backward, kicking out with both legs, driving the heavy wooden chair straight into Damian's shins. Damian stumbled, cursing. That was all the time Luca needed. Before the echo of the gunshot had faded, Luca was moving. He rolled forward, pulling the concealed weapon from his ankle holster in a blur of motion. "Now!" Luca roared into the comms unit hidden in his ear. The skylights of the warehouse shattered inward as snipers fired from the cranes above. Two of Damien's guards in the shadows dropped instantly. Chaos erupted. Hannah scrambled off the chair, rolling across the dirty floor as bullets began to fly. She heard Eric screaming, heard the distinct thwip-thwip of suppressed rifle fire. She looked up to see Luca sprinting toward her, firing his weapon with deadly precision. His face a mask of terrifying, beautiful rage. He was coming for her, running through the fire, and this time, she was ready to fight beside him. The air inside the warehouse disintegrated into a cacophony of noise that felt solid enough to touch. The sharp crack of sniper rifles from the cranes outside mixed with the chaotic, echoing return fire from Damien's men, turning the cavernous space into a wind tunnel of flying lead and splinters. Hannah was on the floor, scrambling on her hands and knees. The remnants of the rope still dangled from her wrists, tripping her up as she tried to find cover. A bullet sparked against the concrete floor less than a foot from her hand, sending a spray of stone dust into her eyes. She gasped, freezing for a fraction of a second, paralyzed by the sheer proximity of death. "Hannah, get down!" the voice roared over the gunfire, cutting through her panic. "Luca?" She looked up just as a dark shape dove toward her. Luca Moretti hit the ground with the grace of a soldier and the desperation of a man watching his world burn. He slid across the grime, his body colliding with hers, covering her completely. He was a heavy, warm shield against the chaos, pressing her face into the concrete as wood from a nearby pallet exploded under a hail of bullets. "Stay down," Luca shouted near her ear, his hand cupping the back of her head to protect her. "Do not move." He returned fire blindly over his shoulder, his other arm tight around her waist. He dragged her backward, inch by agonizing inch, toward a stack of heavy shipping crates. Hannah scrambled with him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They rolled behind the cover of the crates just as a fresh volley of gunfire chewed up the floor where they had been seconds before. Luca slumped against the wood, his chest heaving. He checked his weapon, his eyes scanning the warehouse floor with a terrifying intensity. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders. "Did they hit you?" "I am fine," Hannah gasped, wiping dust from her face. "I am fine." Then she saw it. Dark blood was blossoming rapidly across the white shoulder of Luca's dress shirt. It was soaking the fabric, a stark, terrifying crimson against the crisp cotton. "Luca!" Hannah cried out, her hands flying to the wound. "You are shot!" She pressed her palms against his shoulder, trying to staunch the flow. The blood was warm and slick, and the sight of it made the world tilt on its axis. He was the invincible Dawn. He was the monster who scared other monsters. He was not supposed to bleed. "It is a graze," Luca gritted out through clenched teeth, though his face had gone a shade paler. "It went through the muscle. I am fine." "You are bleeding," she sobbed, terror choking her voice. "Look at me, Hannah." He grabbed her wrists, pulling her blood-stained hands away from his shoulder to frame his face. His eyes were dark, burning with adrenaline and a fierce, unshakable focus. "I am fine," he repeated, his voice steadying her. "I need you to stay here. I need you to stay low. Can you do that for me?" Hannah looked at him, at the sweat on his brow, the blood on his shirt, and the absolute devotion in his eyes. He was hurt because of her. He had walked into a trap because of her. "Yes," she said softly. "Good." Luca turned back to the edge of the crates, raising his weapon across the warehouse. The tide was turning. Luca's men had breached the perimeter. Shadows moved tactically through the skylights and the side doors, dismantling Damien's crew with brutal efficiency. Damien Cruz realized it too. The arrogance that had defined him an hour ago had evaporated, replaced by the frantic energy of a rat on a sinking ship. He was crouched behind a forklift, his white suit smeared with grease. He looked for an exit, but Luca's men had blocked the main doors. His eyes landed on Eric, who was cowering behind a barrel, clutching a pistol he barely knew how to hold. "Get up!" Damien shouted, grabbing Eric by the collar. Damien hauled the younger man up, Spinning him around, he used Eric as a human shield, pushing him forward while firing wildly over Eric's shoulder toward the crates where Luca was hiding. "Move," Damien ordered, propelling Eric toward a side maintenance door that seemed unguarded. Hannah, peering through a gap in the crates, saw the movement. She saw the line of sight open up. High above on the gantry crane, a glint of metal caught the moonlight. One of Luca's snipers was tracking them, but he could not take the shot with Eric in the way. Damien was going to get away. He was going to vanish, and this war would never end. Hannah saw Damien shift, exposing his leg for a split second as he tried to kick the door open. "Left!" Hannah screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing. "He is moving left." The warning echoed through the warehouse. The sniper adjusted instantly. A single, thunderous crack rang out from the rafters. Damien screamed as his right leg kicked out from under him, shattered by the high-caliber round. He collapsed to the floor, dragging Eric down with him. The gun skittered out of Damien's hand, sliding across the concrete. Luca was moving before the echo faded. He broke cover, advancing on them with his weapon raised. "Stay back," Eric shrieked. Eric scrambled to his feet. He was panting, his eyes wild with terror and a twisted, desperate fury. He looked at Damien writhing on the ground, then at Luca approaching like the Grim Reaper, and finally at Hannah, who had stepped out from behind the crates. It was her fault. In his twisted mind, everything was her fault. Eric lunged. He was faster than anyone expected. He bypassed Damien and sprinted toward Hannah. Luca shouted, but he could not fire. Eric was too close to her. Eric grabbed Hannah roughly, spinning her around and jamming the barrel of his gun against her temple. He hauled her back against his chest, his arm choking off her air. "Back off," Eric screamed, his voice cracking. "Back off or I will paint the walls with her." The warehouse fell into a deadly, ringing silence. Luca froze. His gun trained on Eric's head, but his finger hovered over the trigger. He could not take the risk. At this distance, a reflex twitch from Eric would end Hannah's life instantly. "Let her go." "Eric," Luca said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "It is over." "It is not over," Eric yelled, saliva flying from his mouth. He pressed the gun harder against Hannah's skin. "She thinks she is better than me? She thinks she can just leave?" Hannah felt Eric's heart hammering against her back. She smelled his fear, his sweat, and the cheap whiskey on his breath. She saw Luca standing 10 feet away, his face a mask of torture. He was helpless. For all his power, for all his soldiers, he could not save her if Eric pulled the trigger. "If I cannot have her, no one will," Eric hissed in her ear. Something inside Hannah snapped. She remembered the nights she had spent cowering in the bathroom. She remembered the bruises. She remembered the feeling of being small, of being invisible, of being controlled. And then she looked at Luca, the man who had knelt for her, who had bled for her, who had treated her like an equal. She was not a victim anymore. She was done waiting to be saved. "No," Hannah said. Her voice was trembling, but it was loud enough to carry in the silence. Eric paused, confused. "What? I do not belong to you," Hannah said, her voice rising, steady and fierce. "I do not belong to your control. I never did. You shut up." Eric started to snarl. Hannah moved. She did not struggle away. Instead, she lifted her foot and drove her heel down with all her strength onto the arch of Eric's foot. Eric howled in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Hannah dropped. She didn't just duck. She threw her entire body weight toward the floor, dragging herself out of the line of fire. Luca did not hesitate. The moment Hannah's head cleared the space between Eric's shoulder and the gun, Luca fired. It was a single, clean shot. The bullet struck Eric in the right shoulder, shattering the joint. The impact spun him around, and his gun flew from his useless hand, clattering harmlessly away. Eric collapsed to the ground, clutching his arm and screaming. "Secure them," Luca barked, instantly. Luca's men swarmed the area. 2 guards hauled Eric up, zip-tying his hands. Another team secured Damien, who was still cursing on the floor. But Luca did not watch them. He holstered his weapon and fell to his knees beside Hannah. She was shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a tidal wave. She sat on the cold concrete, gasping for air, her eyes wide. Hannah. Luca reached for her with his uninjured arm. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her neck. He held her with a desperate, crushing strength, as if he needed to physically merge her body with his to believe she was still there. "You are safe," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "You are safe." Hannah clung to him, her hands gripping the back of his tactical vest. She smelled the gunpowder and the copper scent of his blood, but underneath it all, she smelled him. "Your shoulder," she gasped, pulling back to look at him. "You need a hospital. Luca, please. You are losing blood." Luca shook his head, ignoring the red stain spreading on his shirt. He cupped her face with his good hand. His thumb traced the bruise on her cheek where Eric had slapped her earlier, and his eyes filled with tears. "I thought I lost you," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "When I saw him put that gun to your head, I died. Hannah, I swear to you, I died." He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "You are the only thing in this life that makes sense," he whispered. "You are the only thing that makes me want to be more than just a feared boss. You make me want to be a man, a good man." Hannah looked at him, bruised, bleeding, and stripped of all his armor. He was not the terrifying Don Moretti. He was just Luca, and she loved him. "I love you," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Luca's eyes snapped open. "I love you," she repeated, sobbing. "I love the man who saved me, but I love the man who let me save myself even more." Luca let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce. It was urgent. It was a kiss born of wreckage and survival. Hannah threw her arms around his neck, mindful of his wound but needing to be close. They kissed amidst the ruins of the warehouse, surrounded by shattered wood and the fading echoes of war, holding onto each other as the only solid ground in the world. The aftermath of the night at the docks rippled through Raventon for weeks. Damian Cruz's organization crumbled without its leader. Their territories quickly absorbed or neutralized, but the biggest changes happened inside the Moretti mansion. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the house was unrecognizable. The tension that had plagued the hallways was gone, replaced by a quiet, efficient productivity. Luca sat in his study, his arm in a sling. He was signing papers with his left hand, his face set in a grim line. "So that is it?" he asked the lawyer standing before him. "The gambling dens in the lower district are closed." "Yes, sir." The lawyer nodded nervously. "We have liquidated the assets and converted the properties into legitimate warehouses, as you requested. It is a significant loss of revenue." "I do not care about the revenue," Luca said. Closing the file, "I care about the risk. I am done with the street wars. We operate in the shadows, or we do not operate at all." He dismissed the lawyer and turned his chair toward the window. Hannah was there. She was standing by the bookshelf, but she was not dusting. She was wearing a soft cream-colored blouse and tailored trousers, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked rested, though the faint shadow of the bruise on her cheek was still fading. Luca stood up and walked over to her. He stopped a foot away, respecting her space, though his eyes devoured her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope and a passport. He placed them on the small table between them. "This is yours," he said quietly. Hannah looked at the items, then up at him. "What is this?" "It is freedom," Luca said. "There is enough money in there to set you and your sister up anywhere in the world. New names, new history, no debts, no mafia." He took a deep breath, the hardest thing he had ever had to do. "You can leave, Hannah. You can walk out those doors and never look back. You can find a man who does not come home with bullet holes in his shoulder. A man who can give you a simple, safe life." Hannah looked at the passport. She ran her finger over the gold lettering. It was everything she had thought she wanted 6 months ago. Safety, anonymity, an escape. She looked at Luca. He was standing tall, his face impassive, but she saw the tension in his jaw. She saw the way his hand clenched at his side. He was letting her go because he loved her. He was giving her the choice Eric never had. Hannah picked up the envelope. She weighed it in her hand, then she dropped it into the wastebasket next to the desk. Luca blinked, stunned. "Hannah? I do not want a simple life," she said, taking a step toward him, "and I definitely do not want another man." She reached out and took his good hand, interlacing her fingers with his. "I am not going anywhere. Luca, unless you want me to leave, never," Luca rasped, gripping her hand tight. "Never." "Then I am staying," she said firmly, "but not as the maid. I am done cleaning up other people's messes." Luca smiled, a genuine, blinding smile that transformed his face. "No more uniform." He agreed. "No more uniform." She nodded. "And I want to help." "You have a blind spot, Luca. You see the big picture, but you miss the details. You miss the traitor in your ranks because you were looking at the map." "I saw him." Luca looked at her with a renewed respect. She was right. She saw everything he missed. She was not just his heart. She was his eyes. "Done," he whispered. 6 months later, the Moretti mansion was hosting a gala. The elite of the city were there. Politicians, business tycoons, and the remaining power players of the underworld. Luca stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the crowd. He wore a tuxedo, his shoulder fully healed, his presence as commanding as ever. But he was not looking at the guests. He was waiting. A moment later, Hannah appeared beside him. She wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald green that hugged her curves and left her back open, displaying the faint white line of the scar on her rib cage. She did not hide it. It was part of her story. She took Luca's arm, her head held high. She scanned the room, leaning in to whisper in his ear. The man in the gray suit near the pillar. She murmured, "He is nervous. He has checked his watch 4 times in a minute. Do not trust him." Luca smiled, covering her hand with his. "Noted," he whispered back. They descended the stairs together. The room went quiet as heads turned. People whispered. They looked at the woman on the Dawn's arm, the woman who had once been invisible, the woman who had scrubbed their floors. But Hannah did not lower her eyes. She met their gazes with a cool confidence. She was no longer the quiet maid. She was Hannah Cole, the woman who had walked through fire and tamed the monster. And as Luca pulled her close to his side, shielding her from nothing because she no longer needed shielding, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. Right in the center of the frame. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey bringing Luca and Hannah's world to life for you. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Please leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought of the ending. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more passionate, emotional tales like this one, please make sure to hit that subscribe button for Mafia romance stories. Your support means the world to me. Until next time,